Martin, and I'm going to be looking at the live stream camera because otherwise I have to crane my neck to look at you. But I'm so pleased that we've actually got things working because this has been quite it's an experiment for us, this beaming directly into the Scottish Parliament. And actually this is the second of many firsts that we have with the Scottish Parliament. As you mentioned, during Glasgow, we of course held the Code Red Globe Legislators Summit, which was actually at the Scottish Parliament. And that was just in the final few months of the coming back to a certain degree of normality with COVID. And we had social distancing restrictions still in place. But we very successfully worked with the Scottish Parliament, your team there, to have the first ever hybrid Legislators Summit. It was such a success. We were able to reach 5,000 people through the hybrid version of this, that actually this has become the new normal for us. And so when we were thinking about how we prepare ourselves for COP27, we worked with our membership across the world and with colleagues in Egypt to have another it was a hybrid event, not in the Cairo Parliament, but in Cairo itself, the COP27 Legislators Summit. So coming to COP28, we wanted to push the envelope even further. Now, as you may be aware, within the UN system, parliamentarians have a very odd status. So within the UNFCCC, we are not regarded as a major group or a constituency. We are actually an informal group. And we are classified as a non-state actor. So this status, this very inappropriate designation for parliamentarians who are not NGOs, who cannot be considered as part of that constituency, is something that we're working on. Earlier this year, we were very fortunate to have a very good, starting a good relationship with the COP28 presidency, who themselves were keen to, as they have said throughout, to be inclusive. And part of that inclusivity, we urged them, was to ensure that there was an embrace of parliamentarians, not just in rhetoric, but actually in providing a designated space for us here at COP. So we have made that happen with the support, I have to say, of the UK government. And in fact, the Minister for Net Zero, the Honourable Graham Stewart, Member of Parliament, is the former president of Globe International. And with the UK's support, we have this wonderful place, which is the first, the Parliamentary Pavilion, which is connected to yourselves. We have a live stream here. And this is day 7. And it's been quite an exhausting few days because we have had a whole series of activities, sessions here. So virtually every day there have been a minimum of 4 to 5 events taking place. We are now at a little bit of lull in the day. So as you mentioned, today is also the first ever parliamentary day. Just across the street from us, so to speak, because the Expo City is exactly that. It's like a city. So there are roads, there are lanes, there's lots and lots of buildings. It's a very, very vast complex. And just across the road from us is the conference center where the Interparliamentary Union are organizing their meeting for the day. So they have a meeting. Many of our members, many parliamentarians are there. We've invited them to come and join us if they can during this report back session to you. But there's a great deal happening. Just to provide you with some examples, because you asked for the state of play in the negotiations. And of course, you'll be reading a lot about what's coming out of COP28, what the mood is, what the big announcements are. It's all over the news. You know, you've got very detailed updates in Carbon Brief and other channels. But I thought what would be helpful to share with you is snippets of conversation with the COP president last night. So I attended a special session with Sultan Al-Jaber, who is the COP28 president, in which he was very candid. So this was his first meeting with observers, so with groups such as ourselves who are here in a formal capacity. And it was really enlightening, and I thought that this is the kind of insight that you wouldn't necessarily have in reporting. So I just wanted to share some things with you. First of all, in terms of what we've seen at this COP, this is a very, very different COP. This is an extremely large COP. So this is, in terms of the population that we have at COP, double the size of Sharm el-Sheikh. Close to 100,000 delegates here, 100,000. Of those, 97 are official delegates, and we've got about 3,000 who are joining virtually. This is a first. This is unprecedented. So you can imagine the pressure that that creates. The atmosphere here is a pressure cooker. There's so much going on. It's very, very difficult to have a sense of, of an overview. It's really very hard. The groups who are here tend to be in their own bubbles. So, if you are, you're tracking loss and damage, you're tracking adaptation, you tend to be entirely consumed by that particular set of negotiations, discussions, etc. So it's very hard to get an overview of how this is working. But in terms of some of the highlights that we have seen, in a rather confusing, as I've mentioned, it's a bit of a circus of a COP. There are a few standouts. So the size, of course, is one. The second is that in an unprecedented manner, within 1 hour of starting the COP formally, the president managed to gavel through the agenda for the COP. Now, this has never happened before, because usually there is a struggle, there is a fight over what should be on the agenda itself, and that becomes a matter of contention. So often that can take a day, sometimes more than a day, to agree. And if you recall, just going back a few months to the last meeting in Bonn, there was a struggle over consensus on what should be in the agenda. But clearly there's been a lot of hidden diplomacy in between now and then. And the presidency managed to secure within the first hour of opening the session formally agreement on the agenda. So job done. Excellent. The next thing was the agreement on the loss and damage, the operationalizing of the loss and damage fund. Extraordinary. Nobody expected that this would be something that was concluded in the first day. Not only was it concluded, we had an initial offering of 100 million US dollars from the UAE hosts, but that was very quickly followed by the Germans and by very unexpected quarters, Georgia Maloney, for example. And so the loss and damage fund, the operationalizing and the allocation of commitments, I think the commitments now stand in excess of 700 million for the loss and damage fund, was unprecedented. Nobody saw this coming in the first day alone. And what that's created is headroom now, because that was expected to be one of the main areas where there would be political struggle. And that's not happened, which means that there are now other issues. So, of course, what are the other big issues? We know that fossil fuels is going to be a key issue in terms of the language which is adopted in the text. You'll know that at Glasgow, there was almost pandemonium at the very, very end. Glasgow almost didn't conclude on time because of the struggle about the language, phase down or phase out. So that's similar here. However, one of the things that's very different is the approach of the presidency. So last night I heard from the COP president. He said, I'm telling you here, I'm entirely committed to 1.5 degrees. And I'm committed because I understand the science. I'm an engineer. He has been very keen, as you will know, to quash the reports which have been there in the press to suggest that he is a climate denier. So he uses the opportunity at every press conference, and he was very candid about it last night. He said, I'm led by science. I understand this entirely. I'm an engineer by training. And I'm here to tell you that I see my mission as keeping 1.5 alive. To quote, 1.5 has been my North Star, and I commit to you that I will keep it within reach. So what does this mean? How does this translate into the expectations of the fossil fuel phase out, phase down? So he said, I'm the first president who has gone to every delegation and asked them proactively, give me the language that you want on fossil fuel. Phase out, phase down. What do you want us to discuss? So this is quite unusual because we are now at the halfway point. And it would be very interesting to see whether countries are able within the next few days to actually come out with language, because it will be very dramatic if this COP ends with a commitment to phasing out fossil fuels. It may just happen because the president has said, I will remain neutral in this. I will not express an opinion one way or another, but I will be neutral, and it will be the will of the conference. Now, as you know, the COP decisions are made by consensus. And Al Gore is here, and he has his own agenda for COP reform. And one of the things that he has been pushing is that instead of this consensus model, he said we need to change that to a majority vote model, such that we have 75% majority of votes means that the proposition is passed. So there are some quite interesting reform proposals on the table now to be taken forward in the coming days, because if it comes to a consensus, then of course it really depends on what the balance of opinion is in the room on the day. And the president has said that he will not intervene in a negative way to quash a popular consensus towards the phasing out of fossil fuels. So that's where we are in terms of fossil fuels. You'll know that in terms of energy, on Energy and Finance Day, we have had an absolute blizzard of new announcements which have been made. In terms of the mobilization of climate finance, we are now looking at sums in excess of 70 billion. Again, this is unprecedented. We've had a number of very interesting initiatives which are gathering momentum. So the Beyond Oil and Gas initiative has gathered even more countries, Spain, Kenya, etc. We've had the Global Cooling initiative, which is, I believe, co-chaired by the UK. So that's something which was announced yesterday. That's also attracted more numbers. We really have momentum here to accelerate the transition to a clean, a green economy, and for countries to align themselves formally with that. I think on some of the other big issues, of course, adaptation, very challenging. So there was text which was released on the draft the goal for adaptation. And you'll recall that last year with the Egyptian presidency, their focus was on delivering the global goal on adaptation. It didn't happen then. So within this negotiation, adaptation is still seen very much as neglected. It's an agenda item which now needs to come into greater prominence. The text that has been presented so far has not received widespread support. So there's a fight over that, but it is an objective of this COP to ensure that there is a global goal on adaptation and adequate financing, a doubling of finance for adaptation at the conclusion of it. And then, of course, we come to the global stocktake. So the global stocktake, so that we have had 5 technical meetings. The texts are still, which are being released, are still very technical. There's going to be a big discussion. It's going to come to a discussion in the coming days in terms of what happens with the global stocktake. But it's important to recognize 2 things in terms of next steps, whatever comes out of the discussions in the next few days. The first is that the Executive Secretary, Simon Steele, promised on day one that he was changing the way that the COP processes were working in terms of transparency. So next year we will see the first of biennial transparency reports that governments are going to have to issue. The next thing, of course, is that the stocktake itself will feed into the next ratchet moment, which will be in 2025. So in 2025, you have countries who are expected to ratchet upwards, not downwards, upwards, their nationally determined contributions. So the global stocktake has to inform that ratcheting up process. So that's where we are. I think those are some of the key issues. But this is turning out to be a very paradigm-shifting COP, I have to say. And that really is, that's the language which is being used by the presidency. The president has said, we want to deliver a new paradigm shift. Business as usual will not work. We have to change the narrative, and we have to present the transition as an opportunity. So on that point, I'm just going to pause. And I do have a colleague here who I'd like to call on, who has been to give you an idea of some of the discussions that have been taking place with members of parliament. I'd like to call on my colleague, Andreas. Would you like to join us here? Andreas Aquila Ackelberg has been working with Mexican parliamentarians and held here in the pavilion a very interesting dialogue between Mexican parliamentarians and UK parliamentarians. And just in terms of context, Mexico was the second country after the UK in adopting a national framework law on climate change, and that was in 2012. Andres, you've been working very closely with a number of members of parliament, and you brought them here today to discuss this next generation of climate change laws. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Malini. Good afternoon to you all. I'm very thankful to be here and to have you listening. Yes, we can share that we did. I come from Mexico, from an NGO based in Mexico called Polea, but I used to work with Globe many years ago. And we had this meeting this morning with Mexican Congress people from 4 different parties and with a representative from the UK government, precisely to share about how legislation can support the achievement of international climate goals. And it was mostly focused on Mexico. As Malini was saying, we were the second country in the world to pass a climate law, the first in the developing countries. And in those times, Mexico used to be a leader, an example, because we did that first step in terms of legislation. I was personally very much involved in the process, supporting Congress people, legislators in the development, in the approval of the law. And as Malini was saying, we are now working as civil society in a process to deliver a so-called new generation of climate legislation. No? Countries like Mexico that, I'm sure you know, this type of legislation evolves very rapidly and needs to be adapted because science also evolves very rapidly, as well as concepts and all these discussions that happen internationally. So that's the idea. We carry out a process that involves, of course, legislators, but also trying to involve from the very beginning the representatives from the executive power at the federal level. Mexico is a federal country. So to have their endorsement of initiating this process, and the process is about consulting people. It's about going, for example, with all the subnational entities in Mexico and how they see climate legislation and what they need. You know, a big country like our country, it has many realities, very forest states and then industrial states and transport states and so on. So it's very interesting what you can get from this bottom-up approach, and at the same time to include the voices, opinion from other sectors such as the academia, the public sector. Private sector is always a challenge, and that's always what I'm trying to get your experience, for example, from the UK in this case, that we had a representative from the UK government, from Foreign Affairs, in how you have dealt with the private sector in their involvement, in their support of new climate legislation. In our country, I think we need to do much better work in including them, since they are, we do have very fossil-intensive sectors, and I think that's the most challenging sector. But we try to consult with everybody, to have the opinions of everybody with the purpose of having raised our ambition. Because as Malini was saying, one of the bottom lines of this COP, and not this COP, but I think forever, is that it's not enough what we're doing. So we need to have more ambitious goals. Very interesting, I think, for you is that the topics that have arise in our discussions in Mexico. Mitigation is always an issue, of course, raising the ambition. As maybe you know, we rose our target last year in Egypt, in Sharm el Sheikh. We had 22% for 2030, now it's 35%. That is under a business as usual scenario. But what we are hearing in this consultation process is that countries like our own, like Mexico and many developing countries, are asking that legislation also includes concepts like climate justice, concepts like addressing with much more attention vulnerability adaptation, and it actually makes sense, no, coming from countries that have not the same tools to face the consequences of climate change, but at the same time including mitigation, no? So I think that's what we are getting from this new discussion in a country that had that discussion 10, 11 years ago around COP16. We were host to COP16 in Cancun. That's when the discussion started in 2010, and it took 2 years for us to achieve our law in 2012. And now 2023, hopefully we will have some proposal ready to be presented to Parliament. So what we were able here in Dubai to have was legislators from Mexico, as I was saying, for 4 different parties. We are around 6, 7 parties. We have 4, and a member of UK government to share their experiences, their ideas, what they think are the most relevant topics, and precisely to have them here, sitting here with us in this venue, is also a way of endorsing this process and being relevant actors, stakeholders, to once going back home to Mexico to follow up whatever the decisions. Another interesting topic in our country is that we are going into election next year. So that's also what we want to try to ensure, that whoever wins the presidency next year also takes climate change as a priority. So I think that's what we discussed today, and we are very thankful with Globe that help us to have this space here at COP28.
Chair, may I, with your permission, may I just mention a few other highlights, and then happy to stop and then answer any questions and take your comments. Just to complete the roundup, so in terms of breakthroughs, and you would have read about this in the newspapers, of course we had declarations for the first time on food. So food systems, a recognition that the transformation in food systems is going to require a focus upstream, downstream, across the value chain, including the private sector, the role of smallholder farmers, etc. So we do have for the first time a declaration on food systems. We also have a first in terms of health. So there is a declaration on health, and both of those have been adopted. And in many NDCs now, there is in terms of the review of the NDCs, they're taking into account both the impacts on health of climate change, as well as on food security, food systems, food production, etc. So those are two new firsts. Just transition. So I just wanted to, so that we don't just have UK examples, I wanted to bring Scotland into the picture. Yesterday we had a very interesting presentation by a senior member of parliament from South Africa, the chair of the Oversight Committee, Mr. Cedric Froelich. And he talked to us about South Africa's Just Transition reports, which has been put together by the government. It is a very voluminous 180-page tome. It is extremely detailed, and it focuses largely on the transition out of the dependence on coal in particular, what that means for vulnerable communities, both urban as well as rural. And we spoke about the examples that could be gained and the learning that could be gained from other parts of the world that are also faced with this challenge of supporting communities exiting from fossil fuel dependent economies, local economies. And in that context, Scotland had come up, but also in the context of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. And just this morning, we heard from Jim Skee, Professor Jim Skee from Imperial College, of course, now that, for the second time, the chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. And the examples, that were given and the experience of Scotland is extremely relevant, of course, because there is a Just Transition working group that's working on the tech. So this is a very, very live issue, how you make that happen. And as the trade unions emphasized yesterday, you make the Just Transition happen with worker guarantees. So who's going to pay to support vulnerable communities, especially the female-headed households that remain behind when men typically moving out, migrating to where the mines are in South Africa, an example, for example, in that particular case. Other relevant points, yes, so just to end with one final one, I think this may be of great interest. On Sunday, we saw the launch of an initiative called Climate Trace. This was actually the kind of second launch, because initially it had been, this is an initiative which was launched by Al Gore. It came to light in the Sharm el-Sheikh last year at COP27. It's an initiative which brings together tech companies. And Climate Trace is a new source of data which enables decision makers to identify specifically where emissions are coming from, down to a plant level. So this would be extremely helpful in identifying the locus of emissions as well as the scale of emissions. So this initiative, which was initially launched at COP27, they have now been working on building up their data through satellite imagery, and Al Gore presented the latest version of it. And we're in contact with his office because we think that this would be immensely valuable for members of parliament to be able to access this. It's public source now, to be able to identify in a very precise way where emissions are coming from and whether there is any asymmetry between what is being reported and what is being seen through the satellite imagery. But if I may just stop now and hand back to you, Chair. Is there a lag?
Thank you very much. I'm just looking to see if there are any questions online that we can take, or does anyone around but maybe I can start it off with and ask you to be very helpful in giving us a summary. I want to ask you for a prediction. What do you predict the big announcement's going to be, and are we all going to be happy with it? What do you think that's going to be?
I would say optimistically that I think that this could be a really game-changing COP. I think that the presidency has been under a real pressure, huge amounts of pressure, to prove themselves. So we are here in a very carbon-intensive city. It's very evident. And the hosts, it's very interesting to look at the dynamics, because Dubai itself, of course, is not an oil-dependent emirate. So in terms of my prediction, I would predict that we should be surprised positively. It's not something that I came into this conference thinking that we could see, but having seen, there is a tremendous sense of goodwill that we want to get something done. And the president yesterday, his words were, there's enough bad news. The world is desperate for good news. And I think if that is what is motivating him to really bring this over the line in a very meaningful way, it could actually set us into a very, very different trajectory. He's talking about reshaping the entire economy across the value chain. He's using language that we've never seen before. Of course, he talks about the need for a 1.5-degree Marshall Plan. But he also says, in response to a question yesterday, well, should we give up on 1.5? And he admitted, he said, I know that there's a debate about it, but his response was quite striking. He didn't say, well, we'll see how we can do it. You know, we must muster the political will to do it. He used a very different analogy. He said, I say it is the power of our people that will enable and allow us to make it happen. So this is, I think, where the thrust of the focus on inclusion, whole of society, could deliver a very unexpected outcome. So that's my prediction.
Probably need a lot of work through the night to make sure that everyone reaches agreement. But we've got a question within the room here for you from Sarah Wyatt, who's one of the parliamentarians in the Scottish Parliament. Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'm told I have to speak loudly in the room, so apologies to everyone around our table. It's been great getting your feedback. I had thought about the loss of damage agreement, but I'm very keen to hear about what changes you think will be particularly relevant to us in Scotland, where we're keen to actually play our part. But what are the opportunities? You've mentioned the just transition. I wondered what your reflections were on how we could actually play a part in Scotland. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the question. You know, on the floor that we are on, where our pavilion is, just about 10 meters down the corridor here, we have the world's leading climate funds in their pavilion. So this is the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Fund, etc. And I was speaking to them today, that's the one pavilion. And then just behind them is the ILO's Just Transition Pavilion. So you'll see that we are very serendipitously located with where the money is and where the just transition, the new thinking is. And so I would say in terms of Scotland, we know that there is a lot more money now which is going to be coming through the pipeline. And actually the analogy that I've heard quite a bit is that the money is going to be coming through a fire hose. There's a lot of finance which is now available, but there is not a good matching with projects which are being developed. So I think in terms of Scotland, where there is good experience of supporting, empowering communities, companies to develop projects which can then be taken to scale through adequate financing, that's what we need to see. That's where we need partnerships. Secondly, coming back to the example that I gave of South Africa, that where we have an example of a country which is determined, which has very thoughtfully produced a just transition roadmap, but is looking for relevant examples of other regions where they have embarked on adopting specific provisions, policies, measures, they may also be measures around supporting community voice, engaging the communities, that there, I think, is another opportunity for collaboration. So we would be very happy to broker that relationship on both the just transition side, as well as in terms of meeting the projects with the climate finance side.
Thank you. I think there's another question from Graham Cook. He's going to need a bit closer to the microphone just to make sure that you can hear him.
Hello, Millie. Nice to see you after our engagement at COP26. I wanted to ask about your reflections on two themes. One relates to the influence of states and nations in the COP28 process. We know there are Scottish Government representatives and it's a COP, and I just wanted to hear about your reflections on that. And the second theme related to gender equity. You picked that up in your opening comments, but just if you could talk to us about how that thread is running through COP28 as well, please.
Yeah, certainly. So nice to see you, Graham. Thank you for your questions. So I know there's a little bit of a lag. So let's pick up the first one, is the role of states and nations and regions and cities and towns, in fact. And just below us, we have the multi-level governance pavilion. So that's where the cities, the towns, the regions, the subnationals are gathering. And actually, I think on the very first day, the First Minister, Hamza Yusuf, had visited. And the role of the subnationals has gained great prominence with this presidency. So for the first time, we had, at the high-level segment, we had governors, we had province leaders, we had mayors, who were given the same ranking as heads of states. That's not happened before. So there is a real focus, we saw it last year also, on delivery and implementation, and of course it is the subnationals, it's the cities, the towns, the provinces who are going to be tasked with with delivery. So there's a lot more attention to them, I have to say. The second question in terms of gender equity, so Graham, you'll probably know that the text on gender has been accepted. So in terms of the negotiations themselves, that just took 6 days. That was not controversial. In terms of the representation itself, if one looks at the gender balance on delegations, not at all 50-50 as yet. So the average is still around 31-32% in terms of the delegations themselves. Looking at the presidency in a conservative Arab part of the world, it has been remarkable. Remarkable, the number of senior women who have been appointed, from the Minister of Environment to the lead climate negotiator. The lead negotiator for the UAE is a young woman, Hana Al-Hashmi. I met her last night. She came over to me and she said to me, she looked me straight in the eye and she said, "Are you ready to make history?" And I said, we have already. We have a parliamentary day, we have a parliamentary pavilion, and we have parliamentarians who are ready to do their bit and be recognized as such here. So, as I say, I mean, I'm really, really surprised very positively at the level of commitment and the sense of responsibility that the Emirati presidency has to this agenda.
I think we don't have any more questions here at the moment, but I see you've got another guest on the stage. Do you want to introduce them and bring them in? Or?
I do indeed. So, yes, indeed. So we were keen that we bring you some direct experience from members of parliament, and I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful colleague, a member of parliament from the East African Legislative Assembly. Now, this is a regional parliament, and her Honourable Françoise Umumukiza is actually from Rwanda. And Françoise, you've been very active these last few days, both in the pavilion as well as outside. So your reflections, please, on what you're seeing here at COP.
Thank you very much. I may even stand up for the purpose of honoring the audience and also participants on this pavilion that is very, very important. The parliamentary pavilion at COP28. I'm Françoise Umukiza. I'm a member of parliament at the East African Legislative Assembly. I'm the chairperson of the Committee on Agriculture, Tourism, Natural Resources. I'm just humbled and honored to be here. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator Malini, for the invitation and also for allowing parliamentarians to be active in this COP. You have raised visibility of, parliamentarians, especially EALA flagship is higher. What I can say here, we have been ambitious to make sure climate change is kind of changing livelihoods, but this time, beyond being ambitious, we are even no longer just drivers. We are becoming actors and actors of development, actors of economic empowerment, actors of women in trade, women in environment protection, women, girls, youth, all these underprivileged, let me say, population. We are there to make sure we raise their voice, we do legislation, we do oversight, and we represent them. So now there is no longer time to waste. It's time now we act, and now we are going, and we need to accelerate the agenda. We need funds, but we also contribute to these funds because we are able to do that. Together, we can make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Françoise.
Okay, I'm just looking, that's great, and it's great to hear that you're having such good conversations with parliamentarians from all around the world. I think we're almost coming to the end of our time. Some of us have to be in the chamber this afternoon, either to listen to great, excellent speeches from our colleagues or from our opposing parties. So I'm right at that stage to say thank you very much. I think you've got another event on Monday the 11th, which I believe is being chaired by our presiding officer, Alison Johnson, who will do an excellent job. And I have to say that because she's the one that chooses whether I can ask questions in the Parliament. But I'd like to thank you and those people that you brought to the table this afternoon to discuss things with us and say thank you very much from Scotland and goodbye. We go back to the cold weather, we go back to the warm weather.
Thank you so much.